I have been an engineer for 41 years. Not a glamorous kind of engineer, not rockets or bridges or anything a person would photograph. Civil work, infrastructure, the unglamorous problem of how water moves through a city, how a drainage system behaves under load, how to calculate the correct thickness of a culvert wall so that it holds for 30 years without anyone ever thinking about it. I spent my career working on things that were only noticed when they failed. That is a particular kind of job. It shapes a man in ways he does not always recognize until much later. I retired at 69. I thought I was done with that kind of math. I was wrong. The math just changed subjects. My name is Gerald Marsh. I am 78 years old. I live alone in a house on Tanner Road in Clarksville, Tennessee, a pale yellow house with a screened porch and a rose garden in the back that my wife Ruth planted in the summer of 1989, the year our youngest was born. She planted it in July in the heat, which is not the right time to plant roses. She knew that. Ruth knew a great deal about the right way to do things and chose her own way regardless, which is one of the reasons I loved her for 44 years without interruption. The roses still come back every May. I take that as a statement of intent from someone who understood long returns. Ruth died 11 years ago this past February. I have not moved from the house on Tanner Road. I have no plans to. I want to tell you about one particular Wednesday evening in October. And I want to tell you about 3:15 in the morning, which is a time I have come to know well. Welcome to Quiet House Stories. Get comfortable and remember the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from. Hit that like button and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to love it here. My 3 children are named Paul, Diane, and Kevin. Paul is 53. He lives in Nashville and sells commercial insurance. He is good at it. He has the kind of phone voice that makes people feel they are being taken care of, which is the most important skill in his profession. And he has used it on me more than once without knowing I recognized it. Diane is 51. She manages a dental office in Murfreesboro and has been with the same practice for 18 years. She is organized, competent, and tends to frame every disagreement as a problem to be solved rather than a position to be argued, which I generally admire except when I am the problem she is solving. Kevin is 48. He works in IT for a logistics company in Memphis and drives a truck he does not need. Kevin calls me on average once every 3 weeks. He means well by those calls. He does not always know what to say, so we talk about sports and the weather and the condition of the Tanner Road driveway, and then he runs out of things to say and hangs up. I have always understood this about Kevin more clearly than he understands about himself. Each of my children is busy. Each of them is, in their own way, a reasonable person. I want to be careful to say that. I have said it to myself many times in the months since October, because it is true, and because it is easy to let it stop being true when you are sitting alone in a quiet house at 3 in the morning. What happened on Wednesday, October 9th, was not the act of cruel people. It was the act of people who had collectively decided, without quite saying so, that my judgment about my own situation was no longer the most important judgment in the room. That is a different kind of wrong. In some ways, it is a harder kind, because there is nothing to be angry at. There's only the long, slow pressure being managed by the people who are supposed to trust you. I should tell you about the money, because the money is the reason they came. Ruth and I built a modest life. I worked for Davidson County Engineering for 27 years, then spent 14 years with a private infrastructure firm before I retired. I was never wealthy. I am not wealthy now. What I have is a house paid off in full since 2004, a pension from the county that covers my expenses without drama, and a retirement account at Merrill Lynch that I opened in January of 1987 and contributed to every single year without exception, including the 2 years when making those contributions required eating less meat and skipping the window air conditioner we needed in the bedroom. The current balance, as of the October 2024 statement, was $681,412.90. That is not a fortune. It is not a secret empire. It is what 41 years of showing up looks like when you write it down as a number. The account had named Paul, Diane, and Kevin as equal beneficiaries since 2003. That is the detail that everything else turns on. The Wednesday in question was October 9th. My children arrived within 20 minutes of each other. Paul first at 5:50, then Diane at 6:02, then Kevin, who had driven up from Memphis, who pulled into my driveway at 6:14 and came to the door carrying a grocery bag with a rotisserie chicken and a 2-liter bottle of Sprite. He had brought enough food for himself, but not quite enough for everyone. I noticed this. I did not say anything about it. I noted it the way an engineer notes a small anomaly in a drainage report. Not because it is catastrophic, but because it is accurate information about how much the project was planned for someone else's comfort rather than the whole system. I made cornbread from the box mix Ruth always kept in the pantry. She used to say that the box mix was honest, which I understood to mean that it did what it said it would do and did not pretend to be more than it was. We ate at the kitchen table. The chicken was fine. The conversation moved carefully. Whether Kevin's daughter Rosie starting kindergarten, a project Diane's office was undertaking. The condition of the back fence I had been meaning to address since September. Careful is the right word. Too careful. The kind of careful that means someone has been thinking about what to say next while you are still speaking. After dinner, Paul cleared his throat. I want to reproduce what followed as accurately as I can, because the exact shape of the words matters. Paul said he had been thinking about my financial situation. He said that at my age, and he paused around the word, placed it gently, like a man setting down something fragile. It made sense for someone to have oversight, a second set of eyes. He said there had been some concerns, among the three of them, about decisions I might make without fully appreciating the implications, or without someone there to catch an error. He paused again. He said he had spoken to a financial advisor, not Franklin Briggs. I noticed immediately, not the man who has managed my account at the Madison Street Merrill Lynch office for the last 16 years, and who knows my financial history better than my own children do. A different advisor. He said this advisor had suggested that adding Paul as a co-manager on the account would offer protection. For me, Diane said she agreed completely. She said she was not trying to take anything away from me. She only wanted to make sure I was not taken advantage of by someone. And she used the word someone the way people use it when they mean you, as in someone like yourself who might not realize. Kevin said, "Dad, you're 78. You shouldn't be making these decisions alone." I want you to take a second with that sentence, not with the cruelty of it. There was no cruelty, not intentional, but with the structure of it, with the fact that it named my age as the reason my judgment could not be trusted, with the fact that it was said in the tone of a man repeating something he had agreed on in the car with his siblings during the drive over, with the fact that Kevin, who calls me every 3 weeks and does not know what to say, had apparently found plenty to say in the planning meetings that preceded my Wednesday dinner. I looked at my 3 children sitting around the kitchen table in the house where they grew up. I looked at the white coffee mug that Ruth bought at the First Baptist Church rummage sale in 2001. White with a small blue rim. Nothing special. Holds heat better than anything I have bought since. I looked at the grocery bag on the counter with the 1 chicken and the Sprite. I looked at the faces of 3 people I had loved their entire lives, who were sitting in front of me with a prepared script and good intentions, and I felt the full weight of what was being proposed. I said, "I hear you. Let me think about it." Paul said, "We can draw up the paperwork this week, Dad. It's not a complicated process." I said, "I hear you." They stayed until 9:30. We talked about other things. Kevin's daughter Rosie was adjusting to kindergarten and seemed to like her teacher. Diane had a dental conference in Nashville in November she was looking forward to. Paul's new car was a gray Acura, and he was pleased with the mileage. At 9:30, I walked all 3 of them to the door. I told each of them I loved them, because I do every day in the complicated way that love persists through disappointment. I watched the last set of taillights, Kevin's, back out of my driveway and disappear down Tanner Road. I locked the front door. I went back to the kitchen and sat down. There are things that happen to a person over time that are not events. They are gradual, like the shift in a foundation. Not a crack, not a collapse, but a slow settling that changes a load distribution in ways that are not visible until you know how to look. What had been happening with my children over the previous 11 months was that kind of thing. It had started the previous November when Paul mentioned, in passing, that he had been looking at some information about power of attorney. He framed it as general research. In December, Diane had called to ask whether I thought about simplifying, her word, my finances, consolidating accounts, perhaps giving someone access. In March, Kevin mentioned that a colleague at his company had set up a family financial management arrangement with his elderly father, and it had worked out well for everyone. In June, Paul had mailed me a pamphlet from an estate planning firm. I had read it. I had placed it in the green file folder in the second drawer of my desk, where I keep things I want to be able to locate later. I noticed all of it. I am a man who makes structural calculations. Noticing the load distribution is what I do. What I had not done until that Wednesday dinner was name it clearly. My children had decided, independently and then collectively, that I was no longer the most reliable steward of my own financial situation. They had not said this directly. They had approached it obliquely, with pamphlets and suggestions and casual questions, until October 9th when they arrived together and set it with a rotisserie chicken on the counter and a prepared plan in Paul's pocket. Some men spend their whole lives being underestimated. They get so accustomed to it that they stop noticing. I noticed. I just needed to be sure before I acted, because a man who has spent 41 years calculating loads before recommending action does not change his method, because someone raised their voice at the table. In this case, no one had raised their voice. That almost made it worse. I am not a dramatic man. I don't make speeches. I don't slam doors. I don't believe in performing emotions for an audience that is already driven home. What I do is sit with a problem until I have the full picture, and then I act. On the night of October 9th, I finally had the full picture. I made a second cup of coffee. I did not add anything to it. I sat in the kitchen with the lamp on and the rest of the house dark, and I thought about what my children had proposed. Not about whether it was well-intentioned. It was not about whether they love me. They do. About what it would mean in structural terms. About what it would mean for the load to be rerouted through Paul. I thought about Franklin Briggs. I thought about the retirement account I had opened in January 1987, for months after Ruth and I had decided to stop renting and buy the house on Tanner Road, because she had said she wanted a yard, and I had looked at the numbers and understood that the only way to have both the house and the future was to start building the future immediately. I had not missed a contribution in 37 years, not in the lean years, not in the years after Ruth got sick, not once. I thought about what it would mean to add a co-manager with signing authority. I did not know exactly what that meant in practical terms, so I thought about what I needed to find out. I went to bed at 12:30. I lay there until approximately 1:40. Then I got up and went to the kitchen. I want to tell you about 3 in the morning on Tanner Road, because that time has its own character that is different from any other. The house at 3 in the morning is completely still. The refrigerator hums in the kitchen. The rose garden is invisible through the porch door, just a dark shape beyond the screen. The lamp on the kitchen table casts a circle of warm light on the wood, and the white coffee mug, and the closed laptop, and my hands flat on the table. Everything outside that circle is very dark and very quiet, and in that darkness and quiet, a man can think with unusual clarity, because there is nothing else to do and no one performed for. I made a half cup of coffee. I sat down in my gray crew neck sweater. I opened the laptop. I am not a fast man with technology, but I am competent. I logged into my Merrill Lynch online account. The portal Franklin had helped me set up 4 years ago, walking me through it patiently without making me feel slow, which I appreciated, and I navigated to the beneficiary designation page. I read the beneficiary page for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and called the 24-hour customer service number listed at the bottom of the account page. The time was 3:09 in the morning. A man named Curtis answered after 2 rings. He was professional and measured, and I could tell from the ambient sound behind his voice that he was in a large call center somewhere. I told him I was an account holder, and I wanted to understand 2 things. First, what the practical effect of adding a co-manager with signing authority would be, and second, what the process was for changing a beneficiary designation. Curtis told me that a co-manager with signing authority could initiate account transactions, request disbursements, and, depending on the authorization level, approve or deny beneficiary changes submitted by the primary account holder. That was the answer to my first question. I sat with it for a moment. Then I asked my second question. Curtis told me that a beneficiary change of the full balance to a new sole beneficiary required an in-person document signature with a Merrill Lynch representative. He could not process it by phone or through the portal alone. I thanked Curtis. I told him I would be at the office Friday morning. I hung up at 3:14. At 3:15, I went back to the portal. There was one thing I could do from the portal without an in-person signature. The account management section included a function to submit a formal written instruction to my account representative, a time-stamped communication that created a permanent record in the system. I could use it to flag the account for beneficiary review and to specify that no third-party co-management access was to be processed without a direct written authorization from me. Submitted in person. It was not the beneficiary change, but it was the door locked from the inside so that no one could change the lock while I was sleeping. I typed the instruction carefully. I read it twice. I submitted it at 3:17 in the morning on Thursday, October 10th, 2024. The confirmation email arrived in my inbox at 3:22. I sat at the kitchen table after that for a long time. I want you to understand something about what I was feeling in that moment, because I think it matters and because I want to be honest about it. I was not triumphant. I was not satisfied the way a man is satisfied when he wins an argument. I was something I did not have a clean word for, something that sits at the intersection of grief and resolve, the way a load-bearing calculation sometimes sits at the intersection of what is structurally correct and what you wish had not been necessary. Grief. Because no man wants to be at his kitchen table at 3:20 in the morning, because 3 people he loves came to dinner with a plan to route his decisions through someone else's hands. Resolve. Because I had spent 41 years learning the difference between a structure that is sound and one that only looks sound, and I knew what I was looking at. Ruth would have named the feeling and the time it took me to describe it. She was faster than me at most things. I have accepted that as one of the permanent truths of my life. Outside the kitchen window, the screen porch was dark. Beyond it, the rose garden was invisible. In May it would not be. I rinsed my coffee mug. I went to bed at 4:11 and slept until 7. On Friday morning at 8:30, I was at the Merrill Lynch office on Madison Street in Clarksville. Franklin Briggs was at his desk when the receptionist walked me back. He stood when he saw me, which he always does, and offered his hand. Franklin is 62 years old and has worked at that office for 23 years. He is not my friend exactly, but he is the kind of professional who has always treated me as a competent adult with a coherent financial plan, which in my experience is worth a great deal and is less common than it should be. I told him I wanted to change the beneficiary designation on my account. I told him I wanted to redirect the full balance to a single new beneficiary. I told him who. There was a brief pause. Franklin said, "Gerald, I want to make sure I understand exactly what you're asking." I said he understood correctly. He pulled up the account on his screen and looked at it for a moment. Then he said, "Before we process this, and we absolutely can process this, this is your account, I want to mention one thing." He told me that if a co-management authorization were ever added to the account, the rules around subsequent beneficiary changes would depend on the authorization level granted. A full signing authority co-manager could, in some account structures, have approval rights over beneficiary changes. I said, "I'm aware." He looked at me for a moment. Then he nodded once and said, "Let me prepare the form." He prepared the change of beneficiary document. I sat across from his desk in the chair closest to the window and looked at the framed photograph on his bookshelf of 2 teenagers I assumed were his children and thought about the year 1987 and the house on Tanner Road and the woman who planted roses in July because she knew what she wanted and did not wait for the right time. Franklin set the form in front of me at 8:47. I read every line of it. I signed my name at the bottom, Gerald Raymond Marsh, the same signature I have been writing for 53 years, since the year I turned 25 and decided to stop writing it like a teenager and start writing it like a man who intended to be around for a while. The document named Clara Marie Marsh, date of birth March 14th, 2012, as sole primary beneficiary of account ending in 7734, effective upon my death. The balance at the time of signing was $681,412.90. Franklin witnessed the signature. He slid the document into a manila folder and told me the administrative processing would take 3 to 5 business days, and that a written confirmation would be mailed to me when it was complete. I thanked him. I shook his hand. I walked out into the October morning. I need to tell you about Clara, because this story does not make sense without her. Clara is 12 years old. She is Kevin's daughter from his first marriage, to a woman named Deb, who lives outside Knoxville and who has, in my observation, done the primary work of raising a child with very little recognition for it. Kevin and Clara have a relationship that is complicated in the specific way that relationships between fathers and daughters become complicated when the fathers are not consistently present. I will not editorialize further about the reasons. What I will tell you is this. Clara has spent 11 of the last 12 Julys in the Blue Room, at the top of the stairs at the house on Tanner Road. She has been coming since she was 4 years old, which means she has been sitting at my kitchen table eating cornbread and asking questions since before she could reach the table without a booster seat. She is the most intellectually alive person I have spent time with in 30 years. She reads constantly. She argues carefully. She changes her mind when the evidence requires it, which is a quality I have found rare in people of any age. Last July, she spent 3 weeks on Tanner Road, and on the last evening before Deb came to collect her, Clara and I sat on the porch after dinner, and she told me she wanted to be a structural engineer. She said she had been reading about it. She asked me 7 specific questions about load-bearing calculations and the properties of different materials, and whether I had ever made a mistake that had real consequences. I answered all 7 questions honestly, including the last one, which required me to describe a drainage miscalculation from 1998 that I have thought about almost every year since. She listened to the whole story, without interrupting. Then she said, "So you fixed it?" I said I had. She said, "Okay," and seemed satisfied. I drove home from Merrill Lynch on October 11th and stopped at the Kroger on the way for a box of the Honest Cornbread Mix. I put it on the counter next to the stove. I called Clara that afternoon. We have a standing bi-weekly call on Friday afternoons, which is a different day from October 11th, but I wanted to hear her voice. She talked about a science project involving the water cycle and a 2-liter bottle for 16 minutes. I asked 4 questions, all of them genuine, and she answered each one with the specific pleasure of a person who has been thinking carefully about something and is glad to be asked. I did not tell her what I had done. I was not going to tell anyone. The document would travel by mail in 91 days and say what it needed to say without my help. The quarterly statement from Merrill Lynch is generated and mailed on the first business day of each new quarter, January, April, July, and October. The statement generated on January 2nd, 2025 covered the October through December period and reflected any changes processed in that quarter, including beneficiary amendments. Statements go to the account holder and to each listed beneficiary at the address on file. Clara's address on file was Deb's address in Knoxville. The statement arrived on January 3rd. Deb called me that evening at 6:42 p.m. I let it ring twice. I answered. She said, "Gerald, Clara got a letter from Merrill Lynch today." I said, "I know." There was a silence on the line. Deb is a woman who chooses her words with care, which I have always respected. She said, "This is a lot of responsibility for a 12-year-old. I said, "She won't be 12 when she needs it." Another silence. Then Deb said, quietly and without any decoration in her voice, "Thank you, Gerald." I said, "She earned it just by being herself. Tell her I'll call on Friday." I hung up at 6:49. Paul called at 8:17 the same evening. I had expected Paul first, which tells you something about how well I know my oldest child. But Paul is always 5 minutes behind where he thinks he is. He said, "Dad, I need to understand what happened." I said, "I believe you got a letter." He said, "You changed the beneficiary." "The whole account? To Clara?" I said, "That is correct." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Dad, we were just trying to help you. We were trying to protect your account. We were worried about you." I want to tell you something about Paul that I mean without any malice. Paul is the oldest. He has been the oldest his entire life, for 53 years. There is a particular kind of responsibility that attaches itself to oldest children, a belief, not always conscious, that it is their job to see the large shape of situations and manage them, and that this role comes with kind of authority the others don't have. Paul is not a bad person. He is not a greedy person. He is a man who has been carrying the oldest child's weight for 50 years, and some of that is calcified into something that looks like oversight when what it actually is control, gentle, well-intentioned, and not as the exercise. I understood that about Paul. Understanding it did not change what I had done. It only told me how to talk to him. I said, Paul, I have been managing my own finances since 1974. That is 50 years. That is 4 years before you were born. I understand the concern. I do not share it. And I want to be straightforward with you about something. What you proposed on Wednesday would have given you signing authority over my account. I hope you understand why I made a different decision. Paul said, Clara is 12. I said, Clara is 12 now. She will be something else when it matters. I trust her with it. That is my right. He said my name. Then he said it again. I let him say it. Then I said, I love you, Paul. I am not angry at you, but I am not available for this conversation. I told him good night. I hung up at 8:26. Diane called the next morning at 9:03. Her approach was different. She was warmer and more searching. She said she understood why I might have felt that the Wednesday conversation was presumptuous. She said that had genuinely not been the intention. She said she was worried about me being alone in that house, not just financially, but in general. I told her I was not alone. I was solitary, and that I had always found those to be different things. She was quiet for a moment and said she was not sure she knew what to do with that distinction. I told her that was okay. We talked for 20 minutes about other things and ended the call in decent shape. Diane has always been the one most willing to let something be complicated without trying to immediately simplify it. I respect that about her. Kevin texted on January 5th, 2 days after the letters arrived. The text said, "Dad, I don't understand why you did this." I read it. I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter. I made a note to reply in the morning. I replied the following morning with 2 words. I know. That was all I sent. Kevin did not reply to that message. As of March, we have not spoken by phone. I expect we will. I am in no particular hurry, and I have learned that Kevin needs time to circle a difficult thing before he can approach it directly. I can give him that. It is March now, the second week of it. The roses on Tanner Road are still dormant. In 8 weeks they will not be. I have been working on the back fence since the middle of February, the section nearest the rose garden that has needed reframing since September. I work on it in the late mornings when the light comes around to that side of the yard. It is not complicated work. It is satisfying work, the kind that produces a visible result for a known input, which has always been my preferred kind. On the last Friday in February, Clara called me for our regular bi-weekly call. She placed third in her school's regional science fair, which she was gracious about. The project that won was better than hers, she said, and she could explain exactly why, and she did. Then she asked me a question I had not expected. She asked if I was planning to come to her school's spring open house in April, because her teacher had a structural engineering unit in the curriculum, and she had told her teacher about me. I told her I was planning to be there. I wrote it in the small calendar I keep on the kitchen counter, in the block for April 22nd. I wrote it in ink. There is something I want to say before I close, because I think it is the truest thing I have found in all of this. What I did on the morning of October 11th was not revenge. It was not punishment. It was not even primarily about my 3 children. It was a decision about a 12-year-old girl who sat on my porch last July and asked 7 specific questions about structural engineering, including the hard one, and who, when I finished answering, said simply, "So you fixed it," as if that were the whole point, as if that were always enough. I have been an engineer for 41 years. The work I did was mostly invisible. Culvert walls, drainage gradients, the mathematics of things that hold. The measure of success in that work was that nothing failed, which meant most days, most years, there was nothing to point to. That is a particular kind of life. It teaches you to think in long returns. Paul and I have spoken twice since January. Both calls were short and polite, and left a gap between us that I can feel clearly and cannot close from where I stand. I want to be honest about that gap. I did not do what I did to create it, but I did it knowing it might, and that is a different kind of responsibility. A consequence does not stop being a consequence because it was not the intention. That distance is real. I am sitting with it. In the accounting I do at 3 in the morning, I count it. Quiet men are not empty men. The people who confuse the two will always be surprised. I used to think that was entirely their problem. I understand now that it is partly mine, that I have not always found the language to show the people I love what I was carrying. Some of that is on me. I can sit with that. 2. The fence is about 3/4 done. I have chamomile tea going warm on the porch railing. The rose garden is dormant but not gone. Ruth knew the difference. She planted in July, in the wrong season, and they came back every year, 35 years running. Some structures hold because they were built right. Some hold because whoever built them refused to let them fail. In April, I will drive to Knoxville and sit in a gymnasium with other grandparents and watch Clara stand beside a poster about load-bearing calculations. I will be 5 minutes early, which is how I go everywhere. I will have nothing in my hands. I will not need anything in my hands. Yeah, I'm okay. And the thing is, I mean it. If you enjoyed this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more real, raw, and family-centered stories. And as always, thank you for being a part of Quiet House Stories. I will see you on the next one.